Thank you for being here this morning for today's press conference. There are many challenges in government today and they occur at every level. None represents a greater threat to state sovereignty of Texas, of Texans, and of the separate states than the reprehensible dereliction of duty demonstrated by the Supreme Court of the United States in recent rulings. In Texas and in the separate states across the Union, the conservative populations are frustrated by the quiet acceptance by state and federal officials of the court's rulings as the law of the land. Citizens are upset by the lack of fortitude by elected officials to act on the counsel of Chief Justice Roberts and of Justice Scalia, whose scathing dissents declared the court to be impotent and without authority to enforce its rulings, targeting the court's lawless ruling on same-sex marriage, writing that the ruling lacked law or constitutional authority. I am thankful that here in Texas, we have elected conservatives to serve in our statewide offices, in the Texas Senate, and among my colleagues in the Texas House. Here in Texas and across our nation, our elected state officials must hear our voices calling for the constitutional restitution of the sovereignty of the separate states and of the people, and rejecting the unconstitutional rulings of the U.S. Supreme Court. Concerning the attorney's perspective of the Supreme Court being the final authority, the words of Chief Justice Roberts in his dissent: "As a judge, I find the majority's position indefensible as a matter of constitutional law," alleges the behavior of Justices Kennedy, Breyer, Sotomayor, Keegan, and Ginsburg to be without law or hint of constitutional authority. It is glaringly clear to citizens that these justices are guilty of bad behavior. Our founding fathers, fearing the return of tyranny, constitutionally provided for justices to be removed for such behavior. Knowing that the Texas delegation to the U.S. Congress is largely conservative and joins a strong conservative rank at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., our elected federal officials must hear our voices calling for the constitutional restoration of the sovereignty of the separate states and of the people. In order to act constitutionally, to restore state sovereignty, Justices Kennedy, Breyer, Sotomayor, Keegan, and Ginsburg must face impeachment proceedings for their bad behavior and the dereliction of constitutional duty found in the unethical abandoning of the rules of law, of constitutional precedents, and of constitutional constraint for their personal beliefs and political agendas. The United States Congress must act to constitutionally restrict the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court over all matters except those where original authority exists. The right to review all other cases being reserved by the judiciary branch of the governments of the separate states. We as the citizens of Texas and of the separate states must be vocal. We must let our state and federal elected officials know that we support the constitutional restoration of state sovereignty, and that we will stand with our state and federal elected officials who stand up for state sovereignty and reject the lawless rulings of the Supreme Court. In the absence of good behavior by a majority of justices and lacking authority to rule in certain matters, the governors of our states must hold their respective elected state officials accountable to the laws of our states and of our state constitutions. Our governors should stand together in rejecting the striking down of state sovereignty and should form a coalition standing between an overreaching federal government and the citizens of the separate states. We as citizens must act to have our voices heard. I believe the sleeping giant is awake and filled with pent-up frustration with our state and elected officials who lack the will to assert our state sovereignty and our sovereignty as citizens. We as citizens must not accept political conduct where our constitutional sovereignty is or would be exchanged for the political correctness of the day. Pollsters are often used to distort the landscape, and the media in political venues has often demonstrated bias. We as Texans and as citizens of the separate states must know where our state and federal elected officials stand on the issue of the restoration of state sovereignty and of constitutionally remanding the Supreme Court for its rancid behavior. We as Texans and as citizens across our nation must be clear on where we stand. We must make certain that our state and federal officials know that we are an informed voting electorate, ready to lend our support and to cast our ballots for the elected officials who will stand for our sovereignty as states and as citizens. And we are willing to vote against those who would abandon the sovereignty of our states and of our citizens for political ease. Incensed with the reprehensible conduct of the Supreme Court and dismayed by the tepid response by the majority of our state and federal officials, the Pact for the Constitutional Restoration of State Sovereignty provides individual citizens across Texas and across our nation with a citizen action plan to employ the constitutional provisions our founding fathers provided. Those constitutional provisions having been written to ensure that future generations of Americans, as the free sovereign citizens of the separate states, preserve the constitutional ability to politically accomplish that which our forefathers died for, to throw off the yoke of tyranny. Go to my website at cecilbelljr.com to get your copy of my Citizen Action Plan and the resources that are currently available within the Pact, and to add your signature to the Pact for the constitutional restoration of state sovereignty. Our state and our nation are vastly different than they were just a few scant years ago. People are deeply concerned by the erosion of moral values and the abandonment of our Constitution, all perpetrated on Americans and on Texans under the guise of tolerance and wearing the cloak of political correctness. Our founding fathers intended for a limited federal government where the sovereign power of the states and of the people was limited only by the authorities constitutionally enumerated to the federal government. We, the people of Texas and of the separate states, demand that our state and our federal elected officials act to constitutionally restore state sovereignty. And we remind those elected officials that we will be an informed voting electorate. Thank you for attending today's press conference. God bless you, God bless Texas, and God bless the United States.